Today's video is sponsored by Ground News, of whom more in a bit. Hello. Now, before we begin, my voice is still not where it should be, so apologies for that in advance. That out of the way, let's begin. As I'm fond of explaining, the London Underground is a very old transport system with a lot of history. But today I'm going to talk about one of the newest stations on the network, one of the small handful constructed this century. Today we're going to look at Wood Lane. Wood Lane opened in 2008, but despite being a relatively new station, it's on a very old section of line. As you can probably tell, this viaduct was not constructed in 2007. Actually, there were plans to build this line before the first underground line even opened. The situation was kind of weird, and once again we're going to get into railway politics. Now, in the early 1860s, the Metropolitan Railway was under construction. This is now the Metropolitan Line, and when it opened in 1863, it only ran from Paddington to Farringdon. At that time, it was to be operated by the Great Western Railway. The GWR's terminus was at Paddington, which was quite a long way from central London at that time, so this worked out for both companies. The Metropolitan Railway could run trains without the expense of buying their own rolling stock, and the GWR had access to the City of London proper. And all was well, for a few months. Then the Metropolitan Railway wanted to extend to Moorgate. They asked the GWR to contribute to the extension since they would benefit from it. The GWR countered that if they were paying for it, they should have part ownership, and the Met didn't like the sound of that. Then they had another falling out over the frequency of trains. The Met felt that trains should be more frequent. The GWR countered, nah, it's fine. Things deteriorated to the point where the GWR withdrew their trains. The Met borrowed some terrible rolling stock from the Great Northern Railway, then they bought their own. And then the GWR and the Metropolitan made up their quarrel. They signed a legal agreement to stop the fussin' and the feudin' in 1864. Then came up with better terms in 1868, then better still in 1869. And it's just as well they did, because if they didn't, Wood Lane Station would not exist. In 1861, a proposal was put forward for a railway known as the Hammersmith and City Railway. Hammersmith was a growing town on what was then the very outskirts of London. The backers of the Hammersmith and City envisaged connecting Hammersmith with the then under-construction Metropolitan Railway. Perhaps more to the point, though, they planned to buy some of the cheap and unpromising land along the planned route, hold on to it until the railway became public knowledge, then sell it to the railway at a vastly inflated rate. The legality of this was very dubious even then, but that's Victorians for ya. Not everyone was so enthusiastic about this line. It crossed open farmland. The area known as Shepherd's Bush was quite literally named in those days. Skeptics referred to the proposed station at Latimer Road as Piggery Junction, which is just rude, but we're all entitled to our opinions. But where I'd like a little less opinion and a little more fact is the news, and that's why today's video is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is a news aggregator that not only shows you the news, but who's behind the news. It shows you the stories themselves, and who owns the news outlets covering them, and what biases you can expect. For example, take this story on the recent Spanish floods. I can see that the majority of sources covering this are left-wing, with 40% inclined that way, 30% right-wing, and 30% centre. And I can compare the different kinds of coverage. NRC Handelsblad, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, leans left and concentrates on the rescue efforts. The right-leaning Washington Times concentrates on the reactions of the victims of the disaster. But there are some stories that, let's be honest, certain people would rather you didn't hear at all, and that's where the blind spot feed comes in. This shows you the stories that one side or the other seem to be ignoring. Very interesting, and causes much thoughtful stroking of the chin. I also rather like the custom feed feature, which allows you to get news that relates to topics you want to see. So, if I want to know what's going on in London, say, I can just choose that, et voila. Well, that's more Paris than London, but you know what I mean. If this sounds like a good idea to you, because it is a good idea, then I suggest that you follow the QR code or check out the link in the description, where for this November, Ground News is offering 50% off the Vantage subscription. That's the one I use, with all the fancy features. Alright, now we've got a handle on what's going on now, let's talk about what was happening back in the 1860s, shall we? Although the railway was originally an independent venture, it seems like it was always intended to be run jointly between the GWR and the Met. I mean, it kind of had to be. The Met owned the line it would be connecting to, and the GWR were going to run trains over that line. Of the directors of the Hammersmith and City, 4 were Metropolitan men and 3 were Great Western. The line even had the same engineer as the Metropolitan, John Fowler. With all this in mind, I'm not surprised the two companies decided they needed to get along. The line was built to mixed gauge. The majority of railways in Britain were built to standard or Stephenson gauge, which was 4 feet 8.5 inches wide, or whatever that is in metric. The Great Western was built to broad gauge, which was 7 feet and 1/4 of an inch. The GWR's engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, believed his gauge was the superior one, but standard gauge was just too well established. Mixed gauge was the compromise, broad gauge track with an extra rail to enable standard gauge stock to use it. The line opened on the 13th of June 1864. In 1865, the GWR and the Met officially leased it, and in 1867 they took it over outright. In the early 20th century, the question of electrification arose. The Metropolitan Railway were very keen on the concept, but the GWR didn't really consider it their thing. While the GWR did pay their dues in electrifying the line, to all intents and purposes the Metropolitan took over from 1906. As a result of this, the Hammersmith and City would become known as a branch of the Metropolitan line, as it would remain for the next 8.5 decades. In 1908, Wood Lane Station enters the story, but not the same Wood Lane Station. That year, the Franco-British exhibition came to the area. It was a pretty large affair, and so the Hammersmith and City's directors figured there was money to be made. With this in mind, they constructed a new station to serve the exhibition that opened on the 1st of May. It was on the opposite side of the road from the current Wood Lane. It wasn't intended to be a permanent thing, and it was built out of wood. The station was initially a success, but traffic started to decline and it was closed down in 1914. It reopened for special exhibitions, and lasted long enough to be renamed White City in 1947. Unfortunately, there was a fire in 1959, and given how comprehensively the station was wrecked and how low passenger numbers were, London Transport didn't consider it worth rebuilding. It wasn't until the 1970s that we got the next inkling of a Wood Lane station. In the early part of that decade, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea of building a Channel tunnel. I mean, the concept was nothing new, but it finally seemed like things were getting underway. White City ended up becoming the favoured spot for the London terminus. There were good road connections, the area was in need of investment, and there were 2 underground lines running right through the proposed site. The Central Line already had White City Station, and the proposal envisaged building a new station on the Hammersmith and City Line, more or less exactly where the current station is. I sometimes wonder if this version of the station would have been called White City, just to make things easier from an interchange perspective. Well, regardless, as we know, the Channel Tunnel didn't get built in the 70s, and when we did get it, it didn't go to White City. We'd have to wait until the 21st century to get another station at Wood Lane. In 1991, the Hammersmith and City Line was given a separate identity on the tube map, for the first time well, ever, really. It was the development of Westfield shopping centre that prompted Transport for London to revisit the concept of a Wood Lane tube station. Westfield was to be the largest shopping centre in Europe, and with that in mind, the public transport in the area was going to have to be looked at. The shopping centre was so large that it would be served by 2 stations on the Central line, White City at one end and Shepherd's Bush at the other. The developers agreed to contribute £170 million to improving local transport. This consisted of rebuilding Shepherd's Bush station, adding bus connections, and building a new station at Wood Lane. Wood Lane was designed by Ian Ritchie Architects. When the Hammersmith and City Railway had been built, this was all fields, but a lot had changed since then. Now they were much more restricted in terms of what they could do. Most of the station was built into the viaduct. Aside from the viaduct itself, there is a historic feature of note, and that's this roundel. Now that actually comes from another abandoned tube station, this one on the Central line. This one, which was, again, called Wood Lane, was built by the Central London Railway and opened in 1908. Like the other abandoned Wood Lane I talked about, this one was built for the Franco-British exhibition. It was never ideal, being built in a rather cramped space, and it was altered several times over the years. This roundel was installed in 1915 when a new frontage designed by Stanley Heaps was built. Heaps also designed Maida Vale station on the Bakerloo line, which is the other place where you can find roundels like this. Unlike the other abandoned station, this Wood Lane was quite popular with visitors to the racetrack that was built after the First World War. Unfortunately, it became too popular for the site to handle, no matter how much it was altered. So, in 1947, London Transport closed it and replaced it with White City Station. And the roundel went wherever lost roundels go until it was installed in the third current Wood Lane station in 2008. In 2009, the line to Hammersmith was added to the Circle line, including Wood Lane. This was basically to enable buffer time to be built into the timetable, in a very literal sense. If the line has a terminus, you can build a period into the timetable in which the train waits at the buffers at the end of the line before going out again. If the train is delayed, you can reduce the buffer time to compensate. With the Circle line being a circle, this was difficult to do. So by putting termini at Hammersmith and Edgware Road, you can, in theory, reduce the effect of delays on the Circle line. These days, Wood Lane is a pretty well-established station. As well as Westfield, there are residential developments going up nearby, so it seems likely that it will continue to grow in importance. After 2 unsuccessful Wood Lane stations, I guess it's third time lucky. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the old roundel to my new station. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.